world where your birth determines your worth, one desperate act will challenge an entire kingdom. When a starving street boy risks everything to save a drowning king, while nobles and guards stand frozen in fear, he becomes visible for the first time in his life. But the royal court doesn't celebrate heroes who emerge from the gutters. As whispers of resentment turn to dangerous plots, the boy discovers that being seen might be more perilous than remaining invisible. What happens when mercy collides with tradition? When a king's gratitude faces a nobility's contempt? And how far will those in power go to ensure that a child who dared to rise above his station is put back in his place? Permanently. O Menino Invisível. The cobblestones of the central square gleamed under the spring sun, polished by centuries of feet and the recent scrubbing ordered by the royal steward. Merchants had abandoned their stalls, servants had left their duties, and even the hard-working smiths had doused their fires, all to witness the king's ceremonial procession. The air hummed with anticipation, thick with the scents of expensive perfumes and freshly baked bread that most could only dream of tasting. Amidst this sea of excitement, a small figure darted between legs and skirts like a shadow. Theo, though no one bothered to learn his name, was 11 years old, with ribs visible through his tattered shirt and eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. His bare feet left muddy prints on the immaculate stones as he weaved through the crowd, one hand extended in silent plea, the other pressed against his hollow stomach. "Please, sir, a crust of bread," he whispered to a well-dressed merchant whose belt strained against his ample belly. The man's only response was to shift away, as if poverty might be contagious. Theo tried again with a noble woman whose fingers sparkled with jewels. "My lady, anything to eat? I haven't had—" His words were cut short by a violent shove that sent him sprawling face first into a puddle of filthy water and mud. The royal guard who had pushed him stood towering above, his polished breastplate reflecting Theo's pathetic form like a cruel mirror. "Know your place, street rat," the guard spat. "The king passes through shortly. We can't have vermin dirtying his path." For one terrible moment, the square fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned to the spectacle of the boy lying prostrate in the muck. Then, like a dam breaking, laughter erupted. Cruel, careless laughter that cut deeper than any blade. Women behind painted fans, men with pipes, children who should have shown mercy, all united in their mockery of his misery. Theo slowly raised his head, mud dripping from his matted hair, stinging his eyes. He had long ago learned not to cry. Tears were a luxury for those who expected compassion, but the burning shame in his chest threatened to overwhelm him. He was accustomed to being ignored, to being a ghost that drifted through the streets unseen. But this was worse, being seen only to be ridiculed, to become a moment's entertainment for the fortunate. With trembling hands he wiped his face, his eyes inadvertently catching sight of the grand fountain at the square's center. Its waters sparkled like diamonds, clean and pure, surrounded by marble statues of knights and maidens. It had been prepared for the king's ceremonial blessing, a tradition meant to ensure prosperity for the kingdom. How Theo longed to wash away the filth in those waters, but such a transgression would surely earn him a lashing, or worse. "Nobody will ever truly see me," he thought bitterly, crawling behind a wooden cart laden with vegetables for the feast that would follow the royal procession. His stomach twisted painfully at the sight of the food, so close, yet eternally beyond his reach. From his hiding place he watched the crowd, their excitement building to a fever pitch as trumpets suddenly blared from the eastern entrance of the square. "The king comes! Make way for his majesty!" The massive oak doors of the cathedral swung open, and the king emerged, resplendent in robes of crimson and gold, a crown that caught the sunlight like fire upon his head. Flanked by knights in gleaming armor and advisors in rich velvet, he walked with the measured pace of a man who had never known hunger or cold or fear. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, bodies pressing forward for a glimpse of their sovereign. Theo found himself squeezed between the surging masses, his small frame crushed between bodies that didn't acknowledge his existence. A woman's elbow caught him in the ribs, a man's boot stomped on his bare toes, yet no one paused or apologized. He was simply an inconvenience, not worthy of consideration. The boy fought for breath, panic rising as he was carried unwillingly toward the fountain by the tide of humanity. The ceremony reached its pinnacle as the king approached the fountain. Silence fell over the square as he prepared to dip a golden scepter into the waters, a symbolic union of royal power with the lifeblood of the land. But fate, as it often does, chose that moment to intervene. A startled dove burst from beneath the cart where Theo had hidden, its wings flapping frantically near the face of the king's horse. The magnificent white stallion reared in terror, eyes rolling wildly. The king, caught unaware, lost his balance, his arms windmilling desperately as he toppled backward toward the deep basin of the fountain. Time seemed to slow as the sovereign fell. Guards reached for him but were too far away. Courtiers gasped but remained frozen in shock. The crowd watched in horror, but not a single person moved. Fear of breaking protocol, of touching the royal person without permission, paralyzed them all except Theo. Without conscious thought, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, the boy lunged forward. His decision wasn't calculated. It was pure impulse, the kind that exists before reason or consequence. In that heartbeat between disaster and resolution, the invisible boy made himself seen in the most dramatic way possible. He hurled his small body into the fountain's cold waters just as the king disappeared beneath the surface. The splash silenced the square. The cheering stopped. The world held its breath as both Royal and Ragamuffin vanished under the rippling water. For 3 terrible seconds, the surface remained unbroken. Then came bubbles, a disturbance in the water, and finally, 2 heads emerged, one crowned with gold, the other with mud and desperation. The boy's thin arm somehow supported the weight of the fully clothed monarch, his face a mask of determination as he fought to keep them both afloat. "Help!" Theo cried, his voice cracking with effort. "The king needs help." The spell of inaction broke. Guards rushed forward, faces contorted with a mixture of relief and fury that a street urchin had dared to touch their sovereign. As they reached the fountain's edge, ready to pull their king to safety, a terrible realization dawned in Theo's eyes. He had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. He had made himself not just visible, but unforgettable. And in a kingdom where stability depended on everyone knowing their place, that might be the most dangerous thing of all. O silencio da corte. Water cascaded from Theo's clothes as he broke the surface, his thin arms straining against the weight of the king's sodden robes. The monarch sputtered and coughed, his face ashen, crown askew upon his head. For one breathless moment they locked eyes, the most powerful man in the realm and the boy no one had ever truly seen, united in the vulnerability of near drowning. "The king! Save the king!" The panicked cry shattered the stunned silence that had fallen over the square. Guards surged forward, their faces twisted with conflicting emotions. Relief that their sovereign lived, horror that his salvation came from such unworthy hands. The captain of the Royal Guard, a broad-shouldered man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, reached the fountain first, his mail-clad arms plunging into the water. "Release His Majesty at once, filthy urchin!" he bellowed, yanking the king from Theo's grasp with such force that the boy was pushed underwater again. When Theo resurfaced, gasping, 3 more guards had surrounded the fountain, their spears pointed at his chest. "How dare you lay hands upon the royal person?" The crowd, momentarily united in shock, now fractured into a cacophony of reactions. Some pointed and whispered behind cupped hands, others shouted accusations of witchcraft or attempted assassination, while a few, mostly the poorest among them, watched with quiet admiration for the boy's courage. "Unhand him!" The king's voice, though weakened by his ordeal, cut through the chaos like a blade. "This child saved my life while you all stood frozen." The guards hesitated, their spears still hovering inches from Theo's trembling form. The boy remained half submerged in the fountain, too terrified to move, his eyes darting between the weapons aimed at his heart and the faces of the nobles who had gathered around their king. The contempt in their expressions was unmistakable. This muddy, half-starved creature had disrupted the natural order of things, and for that, they could not forgive him. As courtiers fussed over the king, wrapping him in rich cloaks despite the spring warmth, Theo attempted to climb out of the fountain. A guard immediately shoved him back with the butt of his spear. "Stay where you are, gutter rat, until we decide what to do with you." The contrast was stark and painful. The king surrounded by solicitous attention, wrapped in dry finery, while his rescuer shivered in the water, his lips turning blue from cold. Yet something even colder than the fountain water gripped Theo's heart as he observed the hushed conversations taking place just beyond his hearing. The nobles had formed a tight circle around their monarch, their faces grave as they bent to whisper in his ear. Lord Bartholomew, the king's chief advisor, a man with a pointed beard and calculating eyes, seemed most animated in his counsel. Though Theo couldn't hear the words, the nobleman's gestures were eloquent in their dismissiveness. Each flick of his bejeweled hand seemed to diminish the boy's existence. Each curl of his lip reinforced the message. This commoner's deed must not be acknowledged, must not upset the careful hierarchy upon which the kingdom was built. "Majesty," Lord Bartholomew's voice suddenly rose, audible to all in the square, "we must attend to your health without delay. This unfortunate incident has already caused enough spectacle." The emphasis on unfortunate left no doubt as to what the advisor considered truly regrettable. Not that the king had nearly drowned, but that his rescue had come from such lowly hands. "And the boy?" the king asked, his gaze drifting toward the fountain where Theo remained, a prisoner in the very waters that had moments ago been his battlefield. The silence that followed was deafening. No noble volunteered recognition of the child's bravery. No courtier stepped forward to acknowledge the debt owed. Instead, discomfort rippled through the assembly like a foul wind. How could they possibly celebrate a street urchin without undermining the very foundations of privilege upon which their world was built? Lord Bartholomew leaned close to the king's ear, his voice dropping to a whisper once more. "Majesty, do not sully your honor with this embarrassment. A gold coin tossed to the gutter where he belongs will suffice." Though softly spoken, the words carried on the still air to where Theo huddled, each syllable a knife to his chest. After risking everything, after making himself visible in the most dramatic way possible, he was to be erased again, reduced to a minor footnote in the day's events, a problem to be solved rather than a hero to be honored. The crowd sensed the shift in mood, the collective decision being made to minimize what had occurred. Already, some were turning away, their attention diverted by merchants hastily reopening their stalls, by the promise of ale flowing freely to celebrate the king's survival. The moment of recognition Theo had unwittingly fought for was slipping away like water through cupped hands. As guards roughly hauled him from the fountain, his soaked rags clinging to his skeletal frame, Theo caught a final glimpse of the king. The monarch's expression was unreadable, torn between gratitude and the weight of convention, between the debt he owed and the expectations of his station. "Who is this boy?" The king's question hung in the air, soft yet somehow cutting through the bustle of the dispersing crowd. No answer came. The square seemed to hold its breath, suspended between acknowledgement and erasure. The common folk, who might have known Theo as the orphan who slept beneath the baker's window, remained silent, afraid to draw attention to themselves. The nobles, who had never deigned to notice such a creature, stared through him as if he were made of mist. The guard's grip on Theo's arms tightened painfully as they began to drag him away from the royal presence. The boy didn't struggle. Where was there to go? What was there to fight for? For one glorious moment, he had mattered. Now, that moment was ending, the familiar cloak of invisibility settling once more upon his shoulders. Yet, as he was pulled toward the edge of the square, something unexpected happened. The crowd, previously unified in either mockery or indifference, began to fracture. Some turned their backs, eager to align themselves with the nobility's disdain. But others, a washerwoman with work-worn hands, an elderly cobbler leaning on his cane, a young apprentice with soot-blackened cheeks, watched the boy with newfound respect in their eyes. This division did not go unnoticed by the court. The king's advisors exchanged worried glances as murmurs spread through the commoners. "Did you see how the little one jumped in without hesitation? Not even the king's own guards moved so quickly." Strange that a child with nothing would risk everything, while those with everything risked nothing. Dangerous thoughts, seditious comparisons, Lord Bartholomew's lips thinned to a bloodless line as he observed this unwelcome development. With a sharp gesture, he summoned the captain of the guard. "Remove that urchin from sight," he commanded, voice pitched low, "and ensure this incident is spoken of no more." But the future of the boy who had saved the king, and perhaps unwittingly threatened the social order of the entire kingdom, would not be decided in the public square after all. It would be determined in the shadowed corridors of the castle, in hushed debates behind closed doors, in the conflict between gratitude and fear that now warred in the royal breast. And as Theo was marched away, still dripping from his plunge into waters never meant for one of his station, one certainty remained. The invisible boy had made himself seen, and nothing in the kingdom would ever be quite the same again. As Portas do Castelo, dawn broke over the kingdom with hesitant fingers of light, as if the sun itself was reluctant to illuminate the day ahead. Theo had spent the night in a storage shed behind the town's bakery, his usual sleeping place, though sleep had proven elusive. His clothes, still damp from yesterday's plunge into the royal fountain, clung uncomfortably to his thin frame. The memory of water filling his lungs, of the king's weight in his arms, of spears pointed at his chest. All this had kept him tossing on his bed of straw until exhaustion finally claimed him in the small hours. He was awakened by a rough hand shaking his shoulder. Theo's eyes flew open to find two royal guards looming over him, their expressions a mixture of disgust and impatience. "Get up, boy," the taller one commanded. "You're wanted at the castle." Theo scrambled to his feet, heart hammering against his ribs. Was this arrest? Punishment? The guards didn't clarify, simply flanking him as they marched through the slowly awakening town. The baker's wife, opening her shutters for the day, gasped at the sight. A blacksmith paused mid-hammer, watching the strange procession with narrowed eyes. Children who normally tormented Theo now stared in wonderment, whispering behind their hands. What are they going to do to him? Perhaps they'll hang him for touching the king. No, fool, they'll make him a knight. The last suggestion, offered by a gap-toothed girl of perhaps 8 years, drew scornful laughter from her companions. But Theo noticed how the adults exchanged uncertain glances. Yesterday's events had disrupted the town's understanding of the natural order, leaving a sense of unease that hung in the air like the approach of a storm. His soaked rags had dried stiff and salt-crusted overnight, chafing his skin with every step. One of the guards, noticing his discomfort, grunted and tossed him a coarse brown tunic. "Can't have you looking like that before His Majesty. Put this on." Theo changed quickly, marveling at the feeling of clean, dry fabric against his skin. The tunic was far too large, hanging to his knees and requiring him to roll the sleeves several times, but it was the finest garment he had ever worn. Still, he couldn't help but notice how the guard held his old clothes at arm's length before discarding them in a midden heap, as if poverty itself might be contagious. As they approached the castle, Theo's initial fear began to mingle with awe. He had seen the fortress countless times from a distance. Its soaring towers and massive walls were visible from every corner of the town, but had never imagined he would pass through its gates. Common folk like him only entered the castle as servants or prisoners, and he doubted he was being recruited for service. The guards at the portcullis eyed him with open suspicion, their hands tightening on their weapons as he approached. One spat on the ground near his feet. "This is the one?" he asked, voice heavy with disdain. "This is what all the fuss is about?" "King's orders," replied Theo's escort with a shrug that suggested he shared the sentiment. The massive iron gates groaned open just enough to admit them, then clanged shut with finality. Theo felt the weight of stone and history pressing down upon him as he entered a world never meant for his kind. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. The muddy streets of the town replaced by immaculate cobblestones, the stench of open sewers giving way to the subtle fragrance of herbs strewn across the courtyard, the clamor of daily commerce silenced by the hushed efficiency of castle life. Servants scurried past, arms laden with linens or platters, barely sparing a glance for the ragged boy in their midst. Guards stood at attention, their eyes fixed on some middle distance, though Theo could feel their awareness of him like a physical touch. A falconer crossed the courtyard, a magnificent bird perched on his gloved arm. its value likely greater than everything Theo had touched in his entire life. "Move along," his escort growled, prodding him forward when he paused to gape at a tapestry depicting a hunting scene, its colors more vivid than anything in his gray existence. They led him through a dizzying series of corridors and antechambers, each more opulent than the last. Theo's bare feet sank into plush carpets, then clicked against marble floors inlaid with patterns of such complexity that he struggled to comprehend them. Suits of armor stood like silent sentinels, their polished surfaces reflecting his bewildered face as he passed. Paintings of stern-faced nobles seemed to follow him with disapproving eyes, generations of privilege judging his presumption. Finally, they reached a set of double doors carved with intricate scenes of battle and triumph. Two guards in ceremonial armor, far more elaborate than the utilitarian gear of Theo's escorts, crossed their halberds before the entrance. "The street boy, as commanded by His Majesty," announced the taller guard. The ceremonial guards exchanged a look of barely concealed disdain before uncrossing their weapons with precise, practiced movements. The doors swung open to reveal the great hall, a space so vast that Theo felt his knees weaken at the sight. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows high above, casting jewel-toned patterns across the floor. A massive hearth at one end, large enough to roast an entire ox, crackled with flame despite the mild spring weather. Banners bearing the royal crest hung from the rafters, while long tables lined the perimeter, though they stood empty now, awaiting the evening's feast. And there, seated upon a raised dais at the far end of the hall, was the king. He looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow, without the pomp of procession, yet no less regal. His crown was absent, but authority sat upon his brow as surely as if the golden circlet were still in place. Beside him stood a cluster of advisors, their rich robes marking them as men of importance, their expressions varying from curiosity to outright hostility as they regarded the approaching boy. Theo's escorts halted 20 paces from the dais, then shoved him forward to continue alone. His legs trembled beneath him as he walked the final distance, acutely aware of the dirt on his skin, the lingering smell of the streets that clung to him despite his clean tunic, the absolute certainty that he did not belong in this place of power and privilege. The king leaned forward slightly, studying him with an intensity that made Theo want to disappear into the flagstones. "So," the monarch said at last, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "you are the boy who pulled me from the fountain." It wasn't a question, but Theo felt compelled to answer nonetheless. "Yes, Your Majesty." His voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" The king's question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Theo blinked, confused. Why had he acted? Why had he, who owned nothing and was nothing, risked everything for a man who had never known hunger or fear or invisibility? "Because no one else would," he replied, the truth falling from his lips before he could consider its wisdom. A ripple of outrage passed through the assembled advisors. One, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and cold eyes, stepped forward, striking his staff against the floor with a crack that made Theo flinch. "Mind your tongue, boy. You stand before the king of the realm, not some tavern keeper." The king raised a hand, silencing his advisor with the smallest gesture. His gaze remained fixed on Theo, searching for something in the boy's face. "A bold answer," he said quietly. "Some might call it insolent. Others might call it honest." A faint smile touched his lips. "I find I prefer honesty to flattery these days." The bearded advisor's knuckles whitened around his staff. "Majesty, this child is dangerous. Today, he saves. Tomorrow, he betrays." The common folk already whisper of his deed, making unfavorable comparisons between his actions and those of your loyal guards. Such talk breeds discontent. Send him back to the gutters where he belongs. Theo felt the weight of judgment pressing upon him from all sides. The king's face revealed nothing of his thoughts, but the boy could sense the battle being waged, between gratitude and suspicion, between individual mercy and the demands of the social order that kept men like these in power and boys like him in the dirt. In that moment, watching the indecision play across the monarch's features, Theo realized that his fate hung by the slenderest of threads. Whatever the king decided in the next breath would determine not just where he slept tonight, but whether he would ever again be seen as more than the sum of his rags and hunger. And as the great hall held its collective breath, waiting for the royal verdict, Theo found himself strangely calm. He had already done the impossible once. He had made himself seen. Whatever came next, that moment could never be taken from him. A décision. The great hall held its breath. Dust motes danced in the colored light streaming through stained glass, suspended in time just as every heart seemed to pause in anticipation. The king's fingers drummed once, twice against the carved arm of his throne. A habit, Theo noticed, that betrayed deep thought behind the impassive royal mask. Then, with a deliberate straightening of his shoulders, the king rose. The entire court immediately stood at attention, a ripple of movement and rustling fabric that spread outward from the throne like a stone dropped in still water. "I have made my decision," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly to the farthest corners of the hall. "This boy will be my protege." The words fell like thunder in the silent chamber. For one heartbeat, no one moved or spoke. Then, as the declaration's meaning penetrated, chaos erupted. Courtiers gasped and murmured to one another behind cupped hands. Guards exchanged uneasy glances, shifting their weight from foot to foot. The king's advisors, most visibly shocked of all, broke their careful formation to cluster together in agitated conference. "Majesty, I must protest." Lord Bartholomew, the silver-bearded advisor who had spoken against Theo earlier, stepped forward. His face had drained of color, leaving two bright spots of indignation high on his cheeks. "This is unprecedented. The boy is unschooled, unmannered, unworthy. He saved my life." The king interrupted, his tone deceptively mild. "While men who have sworn oaths to protect me stood frozen in indecision, this child acted without hesitation. Tell me, Lord Bartholomew, how is such courage unworthy?" The advisor's mouth opened and closed several times like a fish gasping on dry land. "But your majesty, consider the implications." "I have considered them." The king descended 3 steps from the dais, every eye in the hall following his movement. He stopped before Theo, who found himself unable to breathe under the weight of such scrutiny. "A king who does not acknowledge his debts is no king at all, but a tyrant. I will not be remembered as a man who rewards loyalty with indifference." Theo's mind reeled. Protégé? The word was foreign to him, its meaning unclear, but the reactions it provoked left little doubt of its significance. Around him, the court seethed with barely contained outrage. A lady-in-waiting had pressed her embroidered handkerchief to her lips as if to stifle a cry of dismay. A knight near the door had gripped his sword hilt so tightly that his knuckles shone white against the leather binding. "But he's a gutter rat," someone whispered, loudly enough to carry. The king's eyes flashed dangerously. "He is now under my protection," he declared, each word precise and weighted with authority. "Any insult to him is an insult to your sovereign. Remember that." A chill silence followed this pronouncement. Theo felt dizzy, untethered from the reality he had known all his short life. Yesterday, he had been invisible, fighting for scraps, sleeping wherever he could find shelter from the rain. Today, he stood in the great hall with the king's protection wrapped around him like an invisible cloak. It seemed impossible, a fever dream from which he would surely awaken. The king turned to a steward hovering nervously at the edge of the dais. "Prepare a chamber for the boy. See that he is bathed, clothed, and fed." His gaze swept the assembled courtiers, challenging any to object. "Tomorrow we shall begin his education." As the implications of the king's decision reverberated through the hall, Theo caught fragments of whispered conversations, like leaves scattered by an autumn wind. Has the king lost his mind? A street urchin in the royal household? What next? Shall we invite the swineherds to dine at the royal table? Lord Bartholomew had gathered several other advisors into a tight knot of conspiracy, their heads bent together, voices urgent but too low to discern. The expressions on their faces spoke volumes, however. This decision would not go unchallenged, at least not behind closed doors. The king seemed either oblivious to or unconcerned by the ripples of discontent spreading through his court. He placed a hand briefly on Theo's shoulder, a gesture at once casual and profoundly significant, before returning to his throne. "This audience is concluded," he announced. "You are dismissed." With that, the tension in the hall broke like a fever. Courtiers dispersed in clusters, their faces a mosaic of emotions ranging from shock to calculation to undisguised contempt. Guards resumed their stoic positions, though Theo noticed how their eyes followed him with new intensity. The king's inner circle of advisors remained, clearly intending to continue the discussion in private. A hand at Theo's elbow made him start. The steward, a thin man with a permanently worried expression, beckoned him toward a side door. "This way, young master," he said, the honorific clearly causing him physical pain to pronounce. As Theo followed, he passed close to where a group of knights had gathered. One, younger than the others, with a scar bisecting his right eyebrow, spat on the floor directly in Theo's path. "Don't get comfortable, guttersnipe," he muttered, just loudly enough for Theo to hear. "Rats don't belong in palaces." The steward pretended not to notice, hurrying Theo along with increased urgency. They passed through corridors both grand and functional, the transition from public spaces to the working heart of the castle, marked by progressively less ornamentation and more practical considerations. Finally, they arrived at a small chamber that, while modest by castle standards, was larger than any space Theo had ever called his own. "You'll stay here," the steward said, his tone making it clear that he considered this arrangement both temporary and regrettable. "A bath will be drawn and clothes provided. The king has commanded you dine in the small hall tonight." He paused, then added with evident distaste, "Try not to embarrass yourself, or His Majesty." Left alone, Theo stood motionless in the center of the room, afraid to touch anything lest it prove as insubstantial as his sudden change in fortune. A narrow bed with clean linens, a small table and chair, a window, an actual glass window, that overlooked an inner courtyard where servants bustled about their duties. All his, at least for now. Outside in the town, the news spread like wildfire through taverns and market stalls, across washing lines and blacksmith forges. "The king has taken in the street boy." The rumors multiplied and transformed with each retelling. Some said the boy must be a lost prince, recognized by some birthmark or token. Others whispered of enchantment or sorcery. A few more cynical souls suggested darker purposes behind the royal interest. By nightfall, the kingdom seethed with gossip. In the Broken Wheel Tavern, ale flowed freely as patrons debated the day's extraordinary events. "The world's gone mad," declared a red-faced cooper, slamming his tankard down for emphasis. "A guttersnipe in the royal court? What's next? Pigs wearing crowns?" "Perhaps it's a good thing," ventured a young woman, a seamstress by the look of her calloused fingers. "Proof that anyone can rise if fortune favors them." "Fortune?" scoffed a grizzled old soldier. "It wasn't fortune that made the boy jump into that fountain when every guard stood frozen. It was courage, something in short supply among those perfumed courtiers." This sentiment, dangerous in its implications, was met with thoughtful silence, followed by murmurs of agreement. The social fabric, so carefully maintained by tradition and hierarchy, had developed a small but significant tier. Meanwhile, in the castle, Theo lay awake in his new bed, clean for perhaps the first time in his memory, dressed in a linen nightshirt soft against his skin. His stomach was full, uncomfortably so, with rich foods he had barely been able to identify, let alone appreciate. The day's events replayed in his mind like scenes from a mummer's play, too fantastic to be believed. But as darkness settled over the kingdom, not all watched these developments with wonder or amusement. In shadowed corners of the castle, whispers of discontent grew more urgent, more conspiratorial. Behind locked doors, plans were already forming to address the disruption to the natural order. "This cannot stand," Lord Bartholomew hissed to his fellow conspirators, a street rat elevated above his station. "The common folk are already spinning tales, making dangerous comparisons between the boy's bravery and the nobility's caution. Such ideas are like sparks near dry timber." In the quiet of his new chamber, unaware of the forces aligning against him, Theo finally surrendered to exhaustion. His last conscious thought was a question that would haunt the dreams of many throughout the castle that night. Was the king's protection enough to shield him from those who saw his very existence as a threat to everything they held dear? O peso da coroa. Theo awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of comfort, a feather mattress cradling his body, warm blankets tucked around him, sunlight filtering through actual glass windows. For one disorienting moment, he believed himself to be dreaming. The rough straw pallet behind the baker's shop had never felt so distant, yet his body remembered it in every aching joint that now found unexpected relief. A sharp rap at the door scattered his thoughts. Before he could respond, a stern-faced woman entered, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her dark dress marking her as one of the castle's senior servants. "Up with you, boy," she commanded, laying out clothes at the foot of his bed. "Your lessons begin after breakfast, and Master Eldridge tolerates no tardiness, especially from—" She paused, her gaze sweeping over him with barely disguised disdain. Unexpected pupils. The clothes she had brought were simple but well-made: woolen breeches, a linen shirt, and a tunic in a muted blue that Theo suspected was chosen to be as inconspicuous as possible. Still, they were finer than anything he had ever worn, the fabric soft against his skin, free from patches or stains. "What am I to learn?" Theo asked, struggling with the unfamiliar toggles of the tunic. The woman's mouth tightened. "Everything a civilized person should know, though whether such knowledge can take root in common soil remains to be seen." She slapped his hands away, fastening the toggles herself with brisk efficiency. Court etiquette, proper speech, how to hold a spoon without resembling a starving dog, how to walk without shuffling like a peasant. Her words stung, but Theo had weathered far worse than verbal barbs. He followed her through the castle's labyrinthine corridors to a small dining hall, where several young pages and squires were already breaking their fast. Their conversation died instantly as Theo entered, replaced by a silence so brittle it seemed ready to shatter at the slightest movement. "This is Theo," the servant woman announced with the enthusiasm of someone introducing a case of plague. "By His Majesty's command, he joins your lessons." She departed, leaving Theo standing awkwardly at the threshold. The other boys, ranging in age from perhaps 10 to 15 years, stared at him with expressions varying from curiosity to outright hostility. They were the sons of minor nobles or wealthy merchants, boys with names and lineages and futures secured by birth rather than chance. They represented everything Theo had never been allowed to be. One boy, taller than the others with auburn hair and a spray of freckles across his nose, gestured to the empty place beside him. "Come, sit, before the porridge grows cold." Theo approached cautiously, aware of the eyes following his every move. He sat gingerly on the bench, studying the array of utensils before him with growing panic. Which to use first, how to hold them. The servant woman's taunt about spoons echoed in his mind. "Like this," the freckled boy murmured, demonstrating with his own spoon. "Small bites, don't slurp." Theo mimicked him as best he could, though his starving body demanded he shovel the food into his mouth as quickly as possible. The porridge was sweetened with honey and studded with dried fruits, a luxury beyond imagining just days before. "I'm Edwin," the freckled boy offered, "son of Baron Thornfield. That's Gilbert beside you, and across are Rafe and William." The other boys nodded with varying degrees of reluctance. Rafe, a stocky youth with close-cropped dark hair, leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. "Is it true?" he asked. "Did you really pull the king from the fountain?" Before Theo could answer, William, thin-faced and haughty, cut in. "Of course he didn't. It's all an exaggeration. Probably just splashed around until the guards did the real work." "I saw it," Gilbert said quietly. His voice carried the lilt of the northern provinces. "My father is captain of the Royal Guard. I was there. The boy jumped in when no one else moved." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. William's face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. The implication hung unspoken between them. The boy with nothing had shown more courage than men sworn to die for their king. The meal continued in strained silence until a bell rang, signaling the beginning of lessons. What followed was perhaps the most grueling day of Theo's young life. Master Eldridge, a skeletal scholar with thinning white hair and a perpetual expression of disappointment, subjected him to an endless barrage of instructions, corrections, and sighs of exasperation. "Stand straight, shoulders back, eyes forward, not at the floor like a guilty hound. We say yes, sir, not yeah. 3 syllables apparently beyond your capabilities. Good heavens, boy, were you raised by wolves? One does not reach across the table like a marauding Viking." By midday, Theo's head throbbed with the effort of remembering 100 new rules. His back ached from attempts to maintain proper posture. His tongue felt thick and clumsy as he practiced formal greetings and responses. Worst of all was the constant sense of failure, that no matter how hard he tried, his origins showed through like mud stains on clean linen. The afternoon brought dance instruction, a concept so foreign to Theo that he might as well have been asked to fly. Lady Beatrice, a pinch-faced woman with bony hands that delivered sharp corrections, seemed personally offended by his clumsiness. "Step, glide, bow, not stomp, shuffle, collapse," she snapped after his 3rd failed attempt at a basic court dance. "How His Majesty expects to present you at the Midsummer Festival is beyond comprehension." The other boys, who had been performing these dances since they could walk, smirked behind their hands. Only Edwin attempted to help, whispering instructions when Lady Beatrice's back was turned. But even his patience wore thin as Theo repeatedly trod on his toes. By evening, when Theo collapsed onto his bed, every part of him ached, not from physical labor as he was accustomed to, but from the strain of trying to become someone else. The weight of expectation pressed down on him more heavily than any burden he had carried on the streets. True to the servant woman's prediction, meals proved especially treacherous. At supper, seated at a long table with other castle residents of middling rank, Theo felt every eye upon him, waiting for mistakes to mock. Which fork for fish, when to drink, how to break bread properly. Each action was a potential humiliation. "Look at him," he heard someone whisper, "holding his knife like he's skinning a rabbit." Laughter rippled down the table, soft but unmistakable. Theo's ears burned, but he kept his eyes on his plate, determined not to show how deeply the barbs struck. Night brought no respite. In the quiet darkness of his chamber, doubts crept in like thieves. What was he doing here? How long before the king tired of his experiment, before novelty faded into inconvenience? The streets, for all their hardships, had rules Theo understood. Here, he floundered in foreign waters, constantly at risk of drowning in a sea of expectations he could never meet. Morning brought a new challenge. Theo's breakfast tray, usually delivered at dawn, was conspicuously absent. His stomach growled as he dressed, wondering if this was some new test of court endurance. When he arrived at the dining hall, the other boys were already finishing their meal. "Nothing for you?" Edwin asked, genuine concern in his voice. Theo shook his head, confused. A serving girl approached, leaning close as she cleared Edwin's plate. "They want you gone," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously to ensure no one overheard. "The steward says you're an embarrassment to the castle, not worth the food you eat." The revelation struck like a physical blow. Theo had endured hunger before. It had been his constant companion on the streets, but this deliberate withholding felt different, more personal, more cruel. Throughout the day, similar slights accumulated. His water pitcher remained unfilled. The fire in his chamber was not lit despite the evening chill. Small things, easily attributed to oversight, yet the pattern was unmistakable. As Theo prepared for bed that night, stomach hollow with hunger, a terrible question formed in his mind. Had the king's interest already waned? Was the royal protection, so dramatically bestowed, now silently withdrawn? He stared out his window at the moon rising over the castle walls, feeling more alone than he ever had on the streets. There, at least, no one had pretended to care before abandoning him. There, invisibility had been a fact of life, not a fresh wound. In the darkness, Theo faced the most painful possibility of all, that in trying to become visible, he had only succeeded in making himself a more prominent target. A grande humiliation. 3 weeks had passed since Theo's arrival at the castle, 3 weeks of grueling lessons, whispered insults, and increasingly bold slights. Tonight, however, marked a turning point. A royal banquet had been arranged to honor visiting dignitaries from a neighboring kingdom, and the king had commanded Theo's presence. "You cannot be serious, Your Majesty," Lord Bartholomew had protested when the order was given. Theo, passing the council chamber on his way to lessons, had paused at the sound of his name. The boy can barely hold a spoon without disgracing himself. "To seat him among nobility is precisely what I intend to do," the king had interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "He has progressed remarkably in his studies, according to Master Eldridge." This was a generous interpretation of the scholar's actual assessment, which had been closer to, "The boy is marginally less hopeless than expected." Still, Theo had felt a surge of pride at the king's defense, however undeserved it might be. Now, as dusk settled over the castle, Theo stood in his chamber, sweating beneath layers of unfamiliar finery. A royal tailor had been dispatched to outfit him for the occasion, producing a tunic of deep forest green with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs. The fabric was so fine it seemed to pour like water through his fingers, making Theo afraid to move lest he somehow damage it. A knock at his door revealed Edwin, similarly attired though with greater confidence. "Ready for the wolves?" he asked with a wry smile. Theo attempted to return the smile, but his face felt frozen with anxiety. "I'll likely make a complete fool of myself." "Probably," Edwin agreed cheerfully, "but at least you'll be a well-dressed fool." They made their way to the great hall, which had been transformed for the occasion. Hundreds of candles cast a golden glow over tables arranged in a U-shape, each draped in snowy linen and set with silver and crystal that caught and fractured the light. Musicians played softly from a gallery above, their melodies nearly drowned by the buzz of conversation as nobles and dignitaries mingled before taking their seats. Theo hesitated at the threshold, overwhelmed by the spectacle and his place within it. Every instinct urged him to flee, to return to the safety of invisibility. But Edwin nudged him forward, and then it was too late to retreat. Heads turned as they entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence as eyes fell upon the former street urchin now dressed as one of their own. A steward directed Theo to his place, not at the high table with the king, thankfully, but still prominently positioned among lesser nobles and honored guests. Edwin, to his relief, was seated nearby, offering a reassuring nod as they took their places. The meal began with a ceremony of such complexity that Theo could barely follow it. Servers moved in choreographed patterns, presenting dishes with flourishes and announcements. Wine flowed freely, though Theo, remembering Master Eldridge's warnings about its effects on the untutored palate, diluted his heavily with water. For the first course, he managed well enough, carefully mimicking those around him as they navigated the array of utensils. The second course brought a momentary panic when confronted with a shellfish dish requiring specialized tools, but he muddled through by observing Edwin's technique. By the third course, Theo had begun to relax slightly, thinking perhaps he might survive the evening without major incident. It was then that Duke Hargrove, seated directly across from Theo, decided to acknowledge his presence. The Duke was a corpulent man with small, shrewd eyes and a reputation for cruelty to his servants. He had been watching Theo with undisguised contempt throughout the meal. "So," he said, his voice carrying clearly during a lull in the surrounding conversations, "you are the gutter rat who has captured our good king's fancy." Conversations near them faltered as heads turned toward this potential entertainment. Theo felt his cheeks burn, but remembered his lessons. "His Majesty has been most generous to me, Your Grace," he replied, careful to use the correct form of address. The Duke's mouth curled unpleasantly. "Indeed, most unusual generosity." He raised his goblet in a mock toast. "To our sovereign's charitable heart, taking in strays while true nobles serve without such recognition." Several courtiers tittered behind their hands. Theo stared at his plate, willing himself to disappear as he had so often done on the streets. But here, in fine clothes at a royal banquet, invisibility was denied him. "Tell us, boy," the Duke continued, warming to his sport, "what special talents earned you this elevation, beyond an ability to get thoroughly soaked at opportune moments?" More laughter now, bolder and crueler. Theo's throat constricted, words failing him entirely. He risked a glance toward the high table, hoping for some intervention, but the king was deep in conversation with the foreign ambassador, oblivious to the drama unfolding. "Perhaps," the Duke suggested with exaggerated thoughtfulness, "we should all take swimming lessons. It seems the surest path to advancement these days." Emboldened by their superior's example, other nobles joined in the sport. A baroness to Theo's left murmured just loudly enough to be heard, "I hear he still steals food from the kitchens. Old habits, one supposes." "My hounds are better trained," commented another lord, prompting fresh laughter. Theo sat rigid, each word a lash across his soul. All his lessons in deportment had not prepared him for this systematic dismantling of his dignity. He glanced at Edwin, who looked pained but remained silent, unwilling to risk becoming a target himself. The Duke, flushed with wine and the approval of his peers, decided to escalate his performance. With deliberate showmanship, he raised his goblet as if offering another toast. "To the king's pet street rat," he declared. "May he remember his place is beneath our boots, not at our table." Then, with a theatrical flourish that could later be dismissed as an unfortunate accident, he tilted his goblet. Dark red wine cascaded through the air, splattering across Theo's face and down the front of his fine new tunic. The liquid was cold against his skin, but shame burned hotter than any fire as laughter erupted around him. Theo sat frozen, wine dripping from his chin onto his lap, soaking into the embroidered fabric that had made him feel, for one brief evening, as if he might belong. The laughter swelled, filling the hall like a physical presence, pressing against him from all sides until he could scarcely breathe. In that moment of absolute humiliation, a single thought crystallized in Theo's mind. Why did you bring me here, if only to destroy me? Not just to this banquet, but to the castle, to a world that would never accept him, that would only ever see the mud and hunger of his origins, no matter how finely he was dressed. Through the blur of unshed tears, Theo became aware of movement at the high table. The king had finally noticed the commotion, his expression unreadable from this distance. But he made no move to intervene, caught between his role as host to foreign dignitaries and his promise to a street boy. That hesitation, that silent weighing of priorities, cut deeper than the Duke's calculated cruelty. The hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if their sovereign would defend his unusual protege or tacitly endorse their torment by his silence. Seconds stretched into an eternity as Theo felt his last hopes crumbling beneath the weight of that silence. Then, movement from another quarter. A figure rose from a seat near the high table, smaller than those around her, dressed in pale blue silk that seemed to capture the candlelight. Princess Eleanor, the king's second daughter, known more for her scholarly pursuits than court appearances, approached with measured steps. The laughter died as she drew near, confusion replacing amusement on the faces of those who had moments ago been so gleeful in their cruelty. The princess stopped beside Theo's chair and, without a word, drew a handkerchief of fine linen from her sleeve. With gentle motions that defied the rigid protocols of rank and station, she began to dab the wine from his face. Silence fell over the hall like a heavy snowfall, thick and absolute. Theo sat perfectly still, scarcely breathing as the princess, a royal princess, tended to him with her own hands before the assembled nobility of two kingdoms. The enormity of the gesture was lost on no one present. When she had done what she could for his face, Princess Eleanor stepped back slightly. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet yet carried in the stunned silence. "I believe," she said, looking directly at Duke Hargrove, "that accidents at table are a sign of poor breeding. Wouldn't you agree, Your Grace?" The Duke's face mottled with rage and embarrassment, but he dared not direct his venom at the royal daughter. Instead, he bowed stiffly. "Your Highness is most compassionate." "Not compassion, Your Grace. Simple courtesy." Her gaze swept the nearby tables, meeting the eyes of those who had participated in Theo's humiliation. Something all here would do well to remember. With that, she turned to Theo and offered the smallest of smiles, a brief private gesture of reassurance, before returning to her seat, her back straight, her bearing every inch the royal princess despite her youth. As conversations gradually resumed around him, Theo remained motionless, the handkerchief clutched in his wine-stained fingers. In his short, harsh life, he had never experienced a gesture of such public kindness. That it had come from the most unexpected quarter, from royalty itself, left him reeling, unable to process the implications. One thing, however, was blindingly clear. Princess Eleanor had just made herself a target for the same forces that sought his destruction. By defending him, she had aligned herself against powerful nobles who would now view her with the same contempt they directed at him. As the banquet continued around him, Theo felt the weight of this new responsibility settle upon his shoulders. Somehow, he had dragged a princess into his struggle for dignity, and the consequences of that unexpected alliance would soon echo through the castle's stone corridors. A inveja de corte. The morning after the banquet dawned with a peculiar stillness, as if the castle itself were holding its breath. Theo rose early, the events of the previous night still burning in his mind, the duke's cruelty, the king's silence, and most vividly, the princess's unexpected intervention. The wine stains had set into his fine tunic, ruining it beyond repair, much like the illusion that he might ever truly belong in this world of wealth and privilege. As he made his way to breakfast, Theo became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Servants who had previously ignored him now watched with sidelong glances, whispering behind their hands as he passed. Two chambermaids fell silent mid-conversation when he rounded a corner, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something that looked suspiciously like respect. In the dining hall, the change was even more pronounced. When Theo entered, the usual contemptuous stares were replaced by looks of speculative interest. Edwin waved him over, his freckled face alight with barely contained excitement. "The entire castle is talking of nothing else," he whispered as Theo took his seat. "Princess Eleanor defending a former street boy before the entire court. It's unprecedented." Theo picked at his porridge, uncomfortable with being the center of such attention. "She was just being kind." "Royalty isn't kind without reason," said Gilbert, joining their conversation with uncharacteristic eagerness. "My father says the princess has always been different, more interested in her books and philosophies than court politics. Still, to publicly align herself with you." He shook his head in wonder. "Align herself?" Theo repeated, alarmed. "She merely showed basic decency." "In the court, there is no such thing as merely anything," Edwin explained. "Every gesture is political, every kindness calculated. The princess made a statement last night, whether she intended to or not." Before Theo could respond, the doors to the dining hall opened to admit William, the haughty boy who had been among his most vocal tormentors. William's face was thunderous as he strode to their table, slapping his hands down on the wooden surface hard enough to make the dishes jump. "Enjoying your new status, gutter rat?" he hissed, voice low but venomous. "Don't think this changes anything. You're still nothing, less than nothing, and now you've dragged the princess into your filth." Edwin rose halfway from his seat. "That's enough, William." "Is it?" William's eyes never left Theo's face. "The rumors are already spreading beyond the castle walls. Do you know what they're saying in the town? That the princess has taken a special interest in the beggar boy, that she defended him like a lover might." Theo felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not true." William's laugh was brittle. "Truth matters little in matters of reputation. My father says Duke Hargrove is livid. He's already sent letters to his allies suggesting the royal family has lost its dignity entirely." With that parting shot, William stalked away, leaving a cold knot of dread in Theo's stomach. He had never considered how his presence might damage those who showed him kindness. The thought that the princess, who had done nothing but offer basic humanity, might suffer for it was unbearable. Throughout the morning's lessons, Theo could think of little else. Master Eldridge droned on about the genealogies of noble houses, but the boy's mind was filled with images of Princess Eleanor facing whispers and veiled insults because of him. As the days passed, the rumors only grew more elaborate. In the corridors, Theo caught fragments of conversations that froze his blood. "The beggar boy has bewitched the princess. They say she visits his chambers at night. The king must send him away before the scandal grows." Each whisper was more outrageous than the last, yet all shared a common thread: that somehow Theo had corrupted the princess, that his very presence was a contamination spreading through the pure bloodlines of nobility. A week after the banquet, Theo was crossing the eastern courtyard when he spotted Princess Eleanor walking alone along the covered gallery, a book clutched to her chest. It was the first time he had seen her since that fateful night. On impulse, he bowed deeply as she passed, hoping to convey his gratitude without words. To his surprise, instead of continuing on her way, she paused and approached him. "You need not bow quite so low," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I am not so formal as my father's courtiers pretend to be." Theo straightened, finding himself face to face with his unexpected defender. She was younger than he had realized, perhaps 15 or 16, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. "Your Highness, I wanted to thank you," he began awkwardly, "for your kindness at the banquet, and to apologize for any trouble it may have caused you." A smile flickered across her face. "Trouble? Is that what they're calling basic decency these days?" She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then lowered her voice. "Do not concern yourself with court gossip, Theo. It is the empty pastime of empty minds. But they're saying terrible things about you because of me." "They've always said terrible things about me," she replied with surprising candor. "Too scholarly, too plain, too opinionated. At least now they've found something new to complain about." Her expression softened. "Are they making your life difficult?" The question touched something in Theo. The simple acknowledgement that his feelings mattered, that his struggles were worthy of concern. "No more than usual, Your Highness." She studied him for a moment, then reached into the pocket of her gown. "Here," she said, pressing something into his hand. "You must be hungry. The servants tell me your portions have been inconsistent." Theo looked down to find a small loaf of bread, still warm from the ovens. The gesture, so simple yet so profound, brought an unexpected lump to his throat. "I can't take this," he protested weakly. "You can and you will," she insisted. "You're not invisible anymore, Theo. Remember that." With a final smile, she continued on her way, leaving Theo standing in the courtyard with the bread clutched in his hand and her words echoing in his mind. "You're not invisible anymore." That evening, as Theo returned to his chamber, he found Edwin waiting outside his door, his expression grave. "Be careful," his friend warned without preamble. "The Duke has been meeting privately with members of the King's Council. My father overheard them speaking of you." "What did they say?" Theo asked, though he could guess the answer. Edwin hesitated. "That you're a disruption, that your presence undermines the natural order, that the King's experiment has gone too far." He placed a hand on Theo's shoulder. "They fear you, Theo. Not for who you are, but for what you represent. The idea that birth doesn't determine worth." After Edwin left, Theo sat on the edge of his bed, turning these words over in his mind. It seemed absurd that he, a former street urchin who still struggled with which fork to use at dinner, could be perceived as a threat to powerful nobles. Yet the evidence was mounting that many in the court viewed him exactly that way. The next morning brought fresh proof of the growing hostility. When Theo arrived at the practice yard for his archery lesson, he found the other boys already paired off, none willing to partner with him. The weapons master, a grizzled veteran who had previously shown him gruff patience, now barely acknowledged his presence. "Master Raleigh," Theo ventured, "might I have a bow today?" The weapons master spat on the ground. "All in use, boy. Stand aside and observe." It was a transparent lie. Several bows hung unused on the rack. But Theo knew better than to argue. He took his place at the edge of the yard, watching as the others practiced, the exclusion a pointed reminder of his tenuous position. Later, returning to his chamber to change before dinner, Theo found a folded piece of parchment that had been slipped beneath his door. Heart pounding, he opened it to reveal a message written in an elegant hand. "Leave while you still can." He stared at the warning, trying to determine if it was a genuine attempt to help or simply another form of intimidation. The parchment was fine, the ink expensive, not the work of a servant, but someone of rank. As he contemplated the message, a shadow passed his window. Glancing up, Theo caught a glimpse of a figure retreating down the corridor, too quickly to identify, but the impression of rich fabric and deliberate movement remained. That night, sleep eluded him entirely. Every creak of the castle's ancient timbers, every distant footstep seemed a potential threat. The warning note lay on his small table, its message both obvious and enigmatic. Leave while you still can. But leave for where? The streets that had nearly killed him? Some distant village where he might start anew? And what of the king's protection, the princess's kindness, Edwin's friendship? As dawn's first light filtered through his window, Theo came to a decision. He would not be driven away by fear and whispers. If he left, it would only confirm what his enemies believed, that he did not belong, that he could be frightened back to his proper place. He had been invisible once. He would not disappear again. With new resolve, he dressed and made his way to breakfast, head held high despite the weight of unseen eyes upon him. The dining hall fell silent as he entered, conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Even Edwin looked troubled, his usual greeting muted. "What is it?" Theo asked as he took his seat. "Has something happened?" Edwin leaned close, voice barely above a whisper. "The king has called a special council meeting. Lord Bartholomew has demanded your removal from the castle. He claims your presence is causing unrest among the nobility and confusion among the common folk." The news, though not entirely unexpected, still struck Theo like a physical blow. "And the king? What does he say?" "No one knows," Edwin replied. "But the meeting is set for noon today." He hesitated, then added, "Theo, if they decide against you, you should be prepared to leave quickly." As the morning hours ticked by, Theo found himself unable to focus on his lessons. Even Master Eldridge seemed distracted, his usual sharp corrections replaced by absent-minded nods. The entire castle held its breath, waiting for a decision that would either affirm that a street boy could rise above his station or confirm that the barriers of birth were indeed insurmountable. When the bell tolled noon, Theo stood alone in the small garden outside the library, his future balanced on the edge of a knife. Whatever was decided in that council chamber would determine not just his fate, but perhaps the answer to a question that had haunted him since the day he jumped into the fountain. In a world determined to render him invisible, could he ever truly be seen? O desfecho. The great throne room stood silent as a tomb despite being filled to capacity. Nobles lined the walls in their finest attire, their faces a collective mask of barely concealed anticipation. Royal guards stood at attention, their polished armor reflecting the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the high stained glass windows. At the center of it all, Theo stood alone on the cold marble floor, feeling smaller than he ever had on the streets. He had been summoned without warning, a stern-faced guard appearing at his chamber door with orders that he present himself immediately before the king. No explanation had been offered, but none was needed. The council meeting had concluded, and now judgment would be rendered. The king sat upon his throne, his expression unreadable beneath his trim silver beard. To his right stood Lord Bartholomew, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his thin lips. To the left, Princess Eleanor watched with worried eyes, her hands clasped tightly before her. The rest of the royal family was notably absent, a deliberate choice, Theo suspected, to distance themselves from whatever was about to unfold. "Theo of no family, no lineage, no land," the king began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You stand before the throne to hear our decision regarding your continued presence at court." A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles. Theo forced himself to stand straight, remembering Master Eldridge's endless corrections. If he was to be cast out, he would at least leave with dignity. "The matter has been debated at length," the king continued. "Many voices have counseled us to return you to your former station, arguing that your presence disrupts the natural order of our realm." Lord Bartholomew's smile widened a fraction. Princess Eleanor's knuckles whitened as she gripped her hands tighter. "In particular," the king said, gesturing toward the assembly, "Duke Hargrove has formally petitioned for your immediate removal, citing concerns about the influence of common blood in royal circles." The duke stepped forward from among the nobles, his corpulent frame draped in velvet and fur despite the mild spring weather. His face bore the same contempt it had when he'd poured wine over Theo at the banquet. "Your Majesty." the Duke intoned with exaggerated deference. I speak not only for myself, but for many loyal nobles when I say this. Experiment has gone too far. The boy may have performed a service, but rewarding him with a place at court sends a dangerous message to the common folk. Already there are whispers in the taverns and markets, questions about why birth should determine station if a street urchin can dine with nobility. His voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. Some even suggest that if a beggar boy can rise so high, perhaps the divisions between noble and common are not as divinely ordained as we have always believed. Such thoughts breed discontent, Your Majesty. They are the seeds of disorder. The king's face remained impassive. You would have us expel the boy who saved our life because his presence makes the nobility uncomfortable? Duke Hargrove bowed slightly. I would have Your Majesty preserve the order that has kept peace in this realm for generations. The boy has been amply rewarded with food, shelter, and education far beyond his station. Perhaps a small stipend to establish him as an apprentice somewhere far from court would be appropriate. Theo felt each word like a physical blow. Not because the Duke's assessment surprised him, he had known all along that most of the nobility viewed him as an unwelcome intruder, but because the king's silence suggested agreement. After weeks of protection and opportunity, it seemed his royal benefactor's patience had indeed run out. We have heard similar arguments from many quarters, the king acknowledged, his gaze sweeping the assembly. Lord Bartholomew has been particularly eloquent on the subject. The chief advisor inclined his head, accepting the recognition with false modesty. I merely seek to protect Your Majesty's reputation and the stability of the realm. Indeed. The king fell silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against the arm of his throne. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a quality Theo had not heard before, steel wrapped in silk. We find ourselves faced with a choice between what is comfortable and what is right, between tradition and gratitude, between appearances and truth. Something in his tone caused Lord Bartholomew's smile to falter slightly. Princess Eleanor leaned forward almost imperceptibly, hope kindling in her eyes. Theo, the king said, addressing him directly, approach the throne. Heart pounding, Theo moved forward until he stood at the foot of the dais. From this position, he could see the fine lines of weariness etched around the king's eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw that spoke of difficult decisions and sleepless nights. When you pulled me from the fountain, the king said, his voice lowered so that only those nearest could hear clearly. What were you thinking? The question caught Theo entirely off guard. I wasn't thinking at all, Your Majesty. I just acted. While everyone else, guards, nobles, advisors, sworn to my service, stood frozen. Why did you, who owed me nothing, risk everything? Theo swallowed hard. Because it was right, he said simply, and because no one else would. The king studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. Rising from his throne, he descended the 3 shallow steps until he stood on the same level as Theo. An unprecedented break with protocol that drew gasps from the assembled court. My lords and ladies, the king announced, his voice ringing with authority. I have made my decision. This boy will not be expelled from court. A wave of whispers swept through the hall. Duke Hargrove's face darkened with anger, while Lord Bartholomew's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Furthermore, the king continued, raising his hand for silence, he will be remembered in the annals of our kingdom as the one who restored my life when all others stood immobile. Complete silence fell over the throne room. Even the most disgruntled nobles dared not voice their objections in the face of such a clear royal declaration. Princess Eleanor's face shone with quiet triumph, though she maintained the decorum expected of her station. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Theo most of all, the king did something truly extraordinary. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his solemn face, and placed his hand on Theo's shoulder. You asked for nothing in return for your courage, he said. No gold, no land, no titles. And so I shall give you something far more valuable, a name and a place that no one can ever take from you. With a gesture, the king summoned a herald, who unrolled a formal proclamation bearing the royal seal. From this day forward, you shall be known as Theodoric Kingsfriend, ward of the crown, and under the special protection of the royal house. Any who seek to harm you or diminish your standing shall answer directly to me." Theo fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just occurred. A name, an identity, protection that even Duke Hargrove dared not challenge openly. It was more than he had ever dreamed possible, more than he had believed himself worthy to receive. "Rise, Theodoric Kingsfriend," the king commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "You kneel to no one but the crown itself." As Theo stood on shaking legs, he became aware of the profound silence that had fallen over the throne room. The nobles who had mocked him, the advisors who had plotted his removal, the servants who had denied him food, all now watched in stunned disbelief as their sovereign elevated a former street urchin to a position that placed him effectively beyond their reach. Duke Hargrove was the first to recover, his face mottling with barely suppressed rage. With a stiff bow that bordered on insulting, he backed away from the throne. "Your Majesty is most generous," he managed through clenched teeth. "If you will excuse me, I find I must attend to urgent matters on my estates." The king inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the withdrawal without comment. One by one, other nobles who had aligned themselves with the duke made similar excuses, each departure a silent protest against the decision they dared not openly challenge. When nearly a third of the assembly had withdrawn, the king addressed those who remained. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom that loyalty and courage are valued above birth in our sight, that actions speak louder than lineage, that no one, no matter how humble their origins, is invisible to the crown." With these words, the formal audience concluded. As the assembly dispersed, their whispers already carrying the extraordinary news throughout the castle, Princess Eleanor approached Theo with a smile of genuine pleasure. "Theodoric Kingsfriend," she said, testing the name. "It suits you well." "I don't know how to thank you, Your Highness," Theo replied, still reeling from all that had transpired. "Your kindness at the banquet was nothing compared to your courage at the fountain," she interrupted gently. "Remember that when the whispers start again, and they will start again." Her expression turned serious. "The king's proclamation has won a battle, not the war. There will always be those who cannot accept that worth comes from within, not from the circumstances of birth." Theo nodded, understanding the truth of her words. The struggle was not over. Perhaps it never would be. But for the first time in his life, he stood on solid ground, with a name that was his alone, and the knowledge that at least some saw him for who he truly was. As word spread beyond the castle walls, the story grew and transformed with each telling. In taverns and market squares, at village wells and around evening fires, people whispered of the street boy who had saved the king, of his rise from invisibility to honor, of the princess who had defended him, of nobles humbled by royal decree. "The king has a new protege," they told each other. "The boy no one saw until he did what none dared." And in this way, a single act of instinctive courage became legend. A reminder that even in the cruelest of worlds, dignity could be born from a single moment of being truly seen. In a world that tries to render some people invisible, the bravest act might simply be refusing to disappear. Theo's journey reminds us that courage isn't measured by strength or status, but by the willingness to act when others stand frozen in fear. His story challenges us to consider: would you risk everything to save someone who had never seen you? Would you have the fortitude to stand tall when an entire system conspires to break your spirit? Perhaps the greatest lesson here is that dignity cannot be granted by royal decree, nor can it be stripped away by cruelty. True dignity comes from within, from knowing your own worth even when others deny it. The king recognized what his court could not, that character transcends circumstance, that actions speak louder than lineage, and that sometimes the most powerful people are those with nothing left to lose. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are invisible people all around us, waiting for someone to truly see them. Be the one who notices. Be the one who acts. And if you appreciated this journey from invisibility to recognition, please support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing for more stories that challenge us to look deeper and reach higher. After all, every one of us deserves to be seen.